Hello, welcome back. This is Balu here once again. Today we are going to talk about software requirement specification. This is part 4 of requirement engineering process. I'll quickly take you to the session objectives. So we are going to talk about what is software requirement specification, and also we are going to deal with IEEE format of software requirement specification. Now in the previous session we actually saw different types of requirements. If you remember, we spoke about functional requirements, we spoke about non-functional requirements, we also saw what are user requirements, domain requirements and system requirements. Now when you put all these requirements together in a document, then it becomes a software requirement specification document. Now this SRS is usually signed off at the end of the requirements engineering phase. So what is SRS? Now it is very evident from the slide is it's a document that comes out of the requirements engineering stage. It contains the complete details about how the system is expected to perform. Now the accuracy and the completeness of the SRS will basically determine the quality of the product. Now if the SRS is really good and compelling, whatever product you deliver out of your software development lifecycle would be clear and compelling and up to the expectation of the customer. Now every SRS will have certain qualities, and I have listed out some qualities here. Now these are some of the basic qualities which are actually required for software requirement specification document. The first quality of an SRS is called as correctness. Now what do you mean by correctness? Correctness means whatever requirements are there in your software requirement specification has to be correct. That means if the SRS is not correct, then your software product or system will also not be correct. So you have to ensure correctness of all the requirements. And one more thing you have to consider is all the requirements should be unambiguous. Unambiguous means there should be no confusion between the requirements. It has to be complete. The requirement should be captured completely. There should not be any requirement which is incomplete, and it has to be, your SRS has to be consistent. So what is the meaning of consistency? Consistency basically means use of standard terms and definitions. It also helps the reader to understand the requirements well. So that is the meaning of consistency. And it has to be ranked for importance and stability. That means all the requirements in your SRS has to be prioritized based upon the importance, and it has to be verifiable. Now what is the meaning of verifiable? Verifiable basically means that we should be able to basically verify whether the final product meets the requirement or not. It has to be modifiable. That means any changes in the requirement should be easily modifiable. You should be able to manage the changes properly, and all the requirements in the SRS must be traceable, which means you should be able to trace back to its origin. Remember that we had talked about the requirement traceability matrix earlier. Now that is where the traceability comes into picture. So these are some of the good qualities of SRS. Now who are the people who are going to use SRS? Now SRS are basically referred by system maintenance engineers, they are referred by system developers, they are referred by system customers, they are referred by system engineers, they are referred by managers. So all these people who are actually involved in the project basically refer the software requirement specification document. Now there is an standard definition, or the standard document format, I would rather say, for an SRS, that is called as an IEEE standard for SRS. IEEE stands for Institute of Electronics and Electrical Engineers. Now they have come out with a standard format. Let us discuss that standard format and see how that SRS is organized. Let me quickly look into that. Okay, now this is my IEEE format for your software requirement specification document. Initially I have something called as a title page. If you can see here, the title is software requirement specification for a particular project. Now the title of the project goes here. Now if you are doing a project on ATM, then the project title automated teller machine comes here. Then you have the version number. Initially it is version 1.0 because it's an initial version. As and when you keep on making changes or adding new requirements, then you can change the version numbers here. The name of the author who has prepared this document has to be written along with the organization and the date it was created. Now later on, once you have done with the title page, then you have the table of contents. Now there are so many sections in SRS, like you have introduction, overall description, external user interfaces, and external interface requirements, system features, non-functional requirements, etc. So all these things are basically the contents of your SRS. Now what is important is you have something called as a revision history. Now what is revision history? Whenever you make any changes, then you have to go back and change the version number. For example, now the initial version of this SRS document is 1.0. Tomorrow at a later date, for example, you come and make those changes. For example, you make those changes on say 10th of September. 10th of September, you make some changes, and once you make those changes, I call that as version 1.1. And what is the reason for change? The reason for change could be say addition of say new requirements. I'm sorry, there's a typo there. Addition of new requirement. So now in this case it becomes version 1.1. So like this you can keep maintaining the revision history of a software requirement specification document. Now this SRS consists of multiple sections. The first section is called as an introduction. So the introduction section basically consists of the purpose. So what is the purpose? Describe the scope of the product that is covered by this SRS. Particularly if the SRS describes only part of the system or a single subsystem. Now what is the intention of writing an SRS? You are capturing the requirement to basically build a software product. Whether you are building the entire product or you are building a sub-product of the main product, that has to be actually written in the purpose, which comes under the introduction section of your SRS. Then you have the document conventions. Now remember, I told you one of the main quality of your SRS is called consistency. Now what is the meaning of consistency? Making the user to read the SRS document properly. For that you have to make use of document sections. So what is document sections? It describes any standards or typographical conventions that were followed when writing the SRS, such as fonts or highlighting that have special significance. For example, let us say that now all your main sections titles will be Times New Roman, and it has to be bold faced, and the size of the font should be 14, and the subsection titles should also be Times New Roman, but the size is 12. That means whenever you are having section and subsection, you have to follow these particular font styling and font spacing or font weightage. This is what you mean by document convention. So document convention basically improves the beauty of that SRS in terms of readability. Then the third important section, next important section would be the intended audience and reading suggestions. Now what do you mean by intended audience and reading suggestion? Who are the people who are actually going to read your SRS? Now in this case I have clearly mentioned that the SRS are read by developers, project managers, marketing staff, users, testers, and documentation writers. If there are any other users who would actually read your SRS, put down their names along with their designations. So they are called as intended audience. Then you have a product scope section. The product scope section will provide a short description of the software being specified and its purpose, including relevant benefits, objectives, and goals. Basically we are telling what exactly is the scope of the project and what is the benefit the organization is going to get after the implementation of the product, what are the objectives and what are the goals of the particular product. Now it is also important to write down references section in your SRS. So what are references section? Now while preparing the SRS, you would have referred a lot of documents, you would have referred a lot of textbooks, you would have referred a lot of technical journals and also internet. So whatever references you have actually seen through and you have actually used in developing the SRS, so those references has to be captured and mentioned under the references section. Then comes overall description, where you are going to give product perspective. So product perspective talks about the context and origin of the product being specified in the SRS. For example, state whether this product is a follow-on member of a product family, a replacement for certain existing system, or a new self-contained product. As I told you earlier, whether this particular product what you are building in this SRS is a new product, or it is a subsystem of any other product, or it is an enhancement of the existing product. So in that scenario, you are supposed to write what exactly is the product perspective. Then you are supposed to summarize the major functions that product is performing in the form of bulleted points. For example, the high level functions a product is supposed to perform. The detailed capturing of the functions need not be captured here, because to capture the details you have another section called section 3, where we are going to capture everything in detail, but in the product functions you are only going to capture the high level functions. Then you have user classes and characteristics. Identify what are the different type of user classes that will basically use your product. For example, you have general users, you have administrators, you have client users. Now under general users you can have multiple number of users. Under administrators you can have multiple number of administrators, and you can have multiple number of clients. So you are classifying them as general, administrator and clients. So these are called as user classes. Then the next section is operating and environment. So you are going to mention what kind of client and server system you need to have in order to use this particular product. Especially if your product is a web-based product, something like an e-commerce portal. Now you have developed an e-commerce portal. In order to access the e-commerce portal, you need to have a client system as well as a server system. The server system will basically contain your e-commerce portal, and you are going to browse that particular portal from the client system. So there are specific requirements of operating system on the client side and on the server side. You need to have specific processor in the client side or a server side, hard disk in the client side or the server side. So all these things are actually captured in the operating environment. Then the next section is design and implementation constraint. So write down if there are any restrictions that will be available for the design and implementation purpose. So describe any items or issues that will limit the options available to developers. For example, I have given an example here. Each user must keep their password as confidential. Moreover, the user must have individual ID for creating login into the system. So this is an implementation and design constraint. Only administrator can control user addition and deletion in the system. Also, this group could only create reports. Now, there is also one of the constraints. Then the next section is called user documentation. Now, you should also specify in the SRS whether you are going to give some technical help to the user along with the product. Now, the technical help could be in terms of user manual or online help or even video tutorials. So if you are providing any of these, then you'll have to mention that in the user documentations. Assumptions and dependencies are also documented. So what are assumptions and dependencies? Something like I have given an example here. Initially only two locations are connected to the system. Let's say that you are building a web application for a huge organization. So initially now you are connecting only two parts of the organization. One part is in Bangalore and another part could be in Chennai. So only two branches are connected. So we can say that that is one of your assumption, and it is a dependency. Then each location is always connected, whether an operator is logged on at the remote location or not. It's an assumption. Each user must have a user ID and password. There is only one administrator. Server must always run under Linux system. So that's a dependency. You cannot use any other system apart from Linux. So that's a dependency. Internet connection is a must. That means your application or product, whichever you have developed, will never work without an internet connection. So it's a dependency. Proper browsers should be installed. So these are some of the dependencies. Okay, then you document external interface requirements. So external interface requirements describe the interface which are required in terms of users. What we also call it as user interfaces. Something like a login screen. Now if you want to actually get into the application, or if you want to create a gateway to the application, you need to have a login screen with a username and a password. Then you need to have hardware interfaces if your product is a combination of both hardware and software, like the biometric system what we were referring, where once it captures the fingerprint, it has to basically match the fingerprint in the database, and it has to mark the attendance in the application, and it has to update the database. Then it is the combination of both hardware and software interfaces. So those hardware and software interfaces should be documented. So software interface could actually mean databases, operating system, etc. So where exactly you are storing your data. The data could be stored in a database, and you can use variety of database management systems, like you can use MySQL, or you can use SQL Server, or you can use Oracle. So those software interfaces has to be documented. Now since you are now actually thinking of a product on a web application platform, then you will have to even document the communication interface, like how server and client communicate with each other. It could be on a protocol called HTTP, which is hypertext transfer protocol, or an FTP. So that becomes a communication interface. Now once you are done with this, then you start documenting the system features. The system features could be in terms of the priority of the requirements, stimulus and response sequences. Then you start with the functional requirements. We have discussed about enough functional requirements in our previous session. Then you talk about non-functional requirements, where you talk about the performance requirements. Then you talk about the safety requirements. Then you talk about the security requirements. When you talk about these requirements, you also document that here in a proper fashion. Then you also document the software quality attributes and business rules. And apart from this, if there are any other specific requirements, those requirements also has to be documented here. And finally, you have an appendix, where you basically properly write down the appendix of that particular SRS. And if you are referring to any kind of analysis models, that also falls under appendix. That is, both your glossary and analysis model comes under both appendix A and appendix B. So that's it. This is the format of the software requirement specification. So it depends from product to product. It's a very big document. It can run through pages. So please understand that once its SRS is complete and accurate, then you will have no problems in delivering the software on time. Okay. So thank you for watching this particular video. I'll see you back in my next video series, which is on Unit 2. Do subscribe to our channel, and don't forget us to like us on Facebook. Thank you.